Elden Ring is the culmination of everything From Software has developed since Demon's Souls. You probably heard variations on that phrase a lot if you paid attention to the discourse around Elden Ring, even before the game was launched, particularly that word, culmination. And it turned out it was true. Contrary to so many disappointments the gaming industry handed to players over the past decades, Elden Ring is indeed the culmination of everything From Software built for over a dozen years. But words are funny, and sometimes they mean more than what people immediately think when they say. Because culmination is about reaching a peak, and From Software did climb it, but it is also about reaching the end of a journey. There are already many video essays on Elden Ring, as well as dedicated analysis and commentary on specific aspects of its design, its story, and lore, how it compares to previous games and how it might influence future titles to come. Although I cannot point to one source I agree with 100%, because I am annoying and I always find space for disagreement, and despite the fact that I could talk about the game for hours, also because I am annoying, this video is a shorter, more focused version of the main argument I would like to make about the game. In the near future I will have commentary on the game analyzing a full playthrough, but for now I wish to discuss the identity crisis the game suffers from, pointing to the end of Souls in favor of a new form, which can be more gamey, more fun, but also less unique.
Do you detest us so utterly?
Before I give any space for misunderstandings, I do not mean it is the last Souls-like game From Software will ever make. It is very likely they will develop a new game, sequel or not, that will be Souls. And it might even be another very good game, and it could even be another Game of the Year. But Elden Ring will still feel like the end of Souls, because it pushed its foundational features as far as it could, and the tensions and fissures that were already showing in all previous games are about to crack. My opinion should not be confused with distaste for the game either. I would not spend over 400 hours playing and testing and learning and experimenting without enjoying the whole process. In other words, I really like Elden Ring. This video attempts to explain why I think the culmination developed by From Software is not the best possible version of what they can do, and why I think it cannot go further from here without major re-evaluations of their design philosophy. Obviously there will be spoilers, particularly about gameplay, so if you have not played From Software games yet, here's the warning. I mostly discuss Elden Ring of course, but I refer to every other game in the series. Every person will have different priorities and preferences, and even the same person can change over time. It certainly happened to me, and I imagine many people experience something similar. But it is important to understand what Souls games have that is particularly positive and successful in bringing people to the series and keeping them engaged. You can define differently, most people will find some disagreement perhaps, but I propose there are three major ingredients in Souls games that make them stand out for players. A relatively simple and grounded combat system, a focus on careful exploration, and a high level of player freedom. Some players are attracted to only one of these ingredients, some enjoy all of them, and all combinations in between. Maybe you're wondering why I am not including the famous high level of difficulty here, given that it is probably the feature most people associate with Souls games. I consider difficulty more like a spice for these three ingredients. It changes the ways you interact with them. Let us talk a little about how each of these three ingredients work. Souls games are not exactly action games. Combat systems can be evaluated in many ways, but if you compare to what other titles offer, you would notice how simple it is. There are no true combos through input combinations like in most fighting games. Enemies usually react to damage the same way, which is not at all or with some amount of stagger, and so on. Combat in Souls is restricted. Your attacks require commitment as they cannot be cancelled by the player once initiated, and you need to carefully manage how much stamina you are spending at any moment. In fact, stamina management has been a cornerstone of the combat system since Demon's Souls, together with action commitment. The reason why this simple system is brilliant is twofold. On the one hand, you understand through trial and error how your actions need to be timed and considered, while at the same time, stamina restricts how much you can stay active in battle. The way stamina regeneration operates forces the player into tactical considerations. If you're playing with a shield, choose wisely when to lower it to regain stamina faster. If you're two-handing a weapon, do not overcommit, or you may be caught without stamina to react. As your actions are not free, your tactics become more important, require more thinking. Second, as a complement to the tactical consumption of stamina, the input simplicity allows the player to be more intentional about positioning and develop animation awareness. Weapons reach in different angles from different distances, so you can experiment and find options through how you position your character in battle. A great example is the club, one of the favorite weapons for level 1 runners in the original Dark Souls. Its moveset is slow, but the heavy attack is a leaping strike that can be initiated from relatively far and deal damage to an enemy that was not able to reach you before. But it also has a slow recovery animation, so you need to measure it carefully. There are other features like poise, hyper armor, parrying, ranged attacks, but they are mostly good complements to the simple core of managing stamina and learning positioning through knowledge of enemies and weapons behavior. This core in itself is enough to always keep the player engaged. All attacks and defensive actions and counters and retreats have to be measured. Exploration in video games is a lot more than just crafting interesting and beautiful environments and parading the player through them. Some other games pushed a lot further in terms of graphical beauty, like Ghost of Tsushima or the new God of War. What these games usually lack, however, is the picturesque quality that From Software titles have. Something made clear by how the Demon's Souls remake, although amazingly detailed, fails to convey the same diseased, plagued look from the original. Sometimes it is better to not get your vistas too beautiful if you want to generate immersion, and that is the ultimate goal of Souls games with their scenarios. Beyond the looks, there is the architecture and geography of each area or level. If I were to select one feature that From Software does better than any other developer, it would not be the bosses, or combat in general, or build variety or difficulty, it would be level design. Pick any major area in any of their games and it is more likely than not that it will be better designed than any levels from other similar games. There are a few stinkers here and there, but overall, even the weaker areas tend to be miles ahead of the rest of the industry. Environments reward careful exploration through interesting layouts that provide opportunities to find shortcuts, important items, storytelling through these items, enemies, or other details in the scenario, multiple possible paths, sometimes through unexpected locations and ways. Area layouts are complex enough to make you feel lost during your first time, but slowly the mazes begin to make sense through exploration, making it always an engaging and challenging task. The original Dark Souls is even better at this, as most of the world is interconnected, making Lord Run feel like a huge level, and then a huge and varied world, even though it probably has less content from a quantity standpoint than Lingrave in Elden Ring. Even considering that only the original Dark Souls had that interconnection, on a level-to-level basis, all the games presented exemplary architecture and geography, with enemy types mostly coherent with their environment. A third component of Souls that helps with their popularity and replayability is the amount of freedom it offers to the player. Sometimes this is accomplished in a friendly way, by offering a variety of tools, weapons, spells, upgrades, a loose leveling system, and so on. The player always has these at their disposal. Some limiting features like weapon durability and material scarcity can always be circumvented if necessary. However, sometimes giving the player a lot of freedom is not exactly the friendliest proposition, as it is also the absence of handholding. Many games, particularly AAA titles, cannot resist the urge to explain all their mechanics and details to players, even to the point of directly telling what buttons to use in specific moments or what actions they should perform during quests. Some are so stringent that they force a fail screen if you deviate, even removing any agency from the player by refusing to proceed until they do it the right way, as intended. Some designers even think that because games are not movies, you absolutely have to railroad the player explicitly instead of nudging. Sure, we developed an interactive art form just for it to become a worse version of an existing non-interactive one. Mind you, it's not necessarily bad to do that, it can serve good purposes and I guess many players need the hand-holding or even like it. But Souls games rarely do these things. Even when the best answer is very convoluted, the player is left to experiment. Now it should be easier to understand what I meant with difficulty as a spice. It permeates the three major ingredients and changes the player's interaction with the game systems. On the combat side, badly calculated movement and actions can be punished, and punished hard after a string of short mistakes in these games. If the game were more forgiving, the tactical side of combat would never really shine. In fact, you can see that when you get too many levels and go through earlier areas, or the general New Game Plus experience, you are so powerful that it simply does not matter anymore. You can mindlessly go through and mow everything on your way. Exploration requires a lot of care and can be difficult in its own right, given the amount of secret paths, dark corners, shortcuts to unlock, items and consumables to find. Again, if there were beacons showing where every possible item of interest is, the joy and challenge of exploration would be greatly diminished. And we already discussed how player freedom can become a difficulty modifier as well. But let's not get too cute. Most of the difficulty still comes from combat, as careful exploration helps you mostly with finding items and materials that will make it easier to go through encounters. Knowing how to use your freedom, as in how to interact with auxiliary systems in the game, like upgrades and leveling, and where and most importantly when to go to any specific situation in the game, these skills also ultimately serve to increase your chances in battle. But given that combat rules and inputs are relatively simple and grounded, they can also become more seamlessly intuitive and allow for harder challenges that are still considered fair by most players. Well, maybe not so much in first playthroughs, as thousands of broken controllers serve as proof, but remarkably so after a while. The move to an open world design presented several possible hiccups, but also many opportunities for From Software. For example, exploration could have experienced a major drop in quality, as it is difficult to string together several areas. Dark Souls was interconnected, sure, but through a series of shortcuts that tended to be very long, not only to mask loading, but also to create a sensible geography. Doing it again proved challenging. Even Yarnan, the closest to Lordran in terms of design, still has a lot of linearity and dead ends in its design. From Software solved this in Elden Ring by managing to integrate the best of both worlds. On one hand, the open world is large and filled with interesting locations and encounters, with a lot of variety for the most part, and still some interesting geography that forces you to look around for potential paths by the creative use of elevation and some obfuscation. On the other hand, any major building is designed to be traversed on foot, with the major components of From Software level design still present. However, they took care into developing locations like Stormvale and Leyndell to not be as restrictive as comparable counterparts in other Souls. The Legacy dungeons have large open areas inside them, a variety of pathways and shortcuts, many items to find, lore to uncover, etc. We got 2 games for the price of 1, a string of very good traditional Souls levels with some exceptional ones. In fact, I think Leyndell is the crowning achievement of From Software level design, period. But also a fun overworld to play with and uncover for dozens of hours, with some very memorable moments, like the Siofra review, the trap to Celia tunnels, and ascending to the Altus Plateau. However, it is important to point out that From Software did not innovate much with the exploration. It is great compared to other open world games, particularly the Ubisoft Abominations, but still not managing to add much to the genre. On the player freedom front, things are better than ever. The sheer variety of weapons, spells, armor, special abilities, opportunities to engage in multiplayer, all of that significantly increases the number of approaches to the game and some of its challenges. There were also some concessions in the hand-holding department, of course, but it is remarkable how few actually were there. The tutorial is still optional, in fact it may be too hidden for some inattentive players, and there are no special combat prompts except in the beginning, still a little too clumsy like the ones in Sekiro. The map needs to be collected piece by piece and never spells out location names until they are discovered. The compass only marks what you chose to mark. Even if you do not know your way around, there are 7 major areas available to you from the start. Such freedom came with its prices though. The world in Elden Ring is so large that fast travel from the start was a necessity, and I wish From Software tried something more creative to account for that problem. Maybe there would be technical problems for doing that, but the number of active graces is too large, and I would prefer if the player could only keep some of them active for fast travel at a time, to discourage mindless collection of checkpoints. The side effect of the current situation is more convenience to the player, but a constant relief of tension, even in the most difficult areas. I am still afraid of the winter lanterns in Bloodborne because I did not expect to get a lamp after surviving the encounter, so I will never simply run past them. I know players want quality of life and convenience, but someone needs to be the adult telling them no sometimes. All in all, exploration and player freedom became easier and friendlier than ever. There is still danger for players who would otherwise need some hand-holding, but it is easy to keep progressing in Elden Ring. You can always find ways to get runes to level up substantially. It is practically impossible to miss the blacksmith, so you can get upgrades easily. If one area is not working for you, there is almost always another option, and so on. The difficulty of Souls was tied to some of these features in the past, but now in Elden Ring it became even more reliant on how tough combat encounters would be. However, how to keep the game challenging after players figured out all the tricks from the previous titles? It is not the kind of question most developers ask themselves. When Guerrilla Games was developing Horizon Forbidden West, they were probably asking many questions. The most important was probably, how can we make players have even more fun fighting machine dinosaurs? They were also asking, how can we make this more interesting so Rambler will finally bother to play it? Or maybe, how can we time this launch in an even more unfortunate release window this time around? Capcom probably wants to improve on making a new Devil May Cry more stylish and a new Resident Evil more frightening. Bethesda wants to craft innovative bugs and glitches. EA and Ubisoft are always in search of new ways to get the player's money. You want to play to your strengths, and like it or not, From Software became a house name for difficult games. Imagine if Sekiro was released with all the changes and new features it had, but also with the difficulty tuned down significantly. It would still be a good game in my opinion, but with the public in general, particularly Souls players, it would be crushed as an example of From Software selling out. It would be bad for the brand. It was inevitable. Elden Ring had to be, even if only at some spots, a difficult game. Moreover, it had to be challenging also for those who played Souls before. But at the same time, it had to be welcoming for completely new players. Such a large game needs a much larger audience than the niche of hard, grindy games that Souls already dominates to some extent. Expansion would require compromise, and it has been the case with every new installment of From Software. It is what I call the difficulty equation, the problem behind every major change they attempted to develop since the original Dark Souls, with varied degrees of success. First, make it more welcoming for new players, but then make it harder for veterans. Finally, do not do it by adding an explicit easy mode or other types of difficulty sliders. And do not forget to make it fair. Solve for exikes. Every game since Dark Souls tried to address the difficulty equation in its own particular way. Dark Souls 2 approached it by having a different type of enemy placement, prone to group fights and ambushes, usually on the direct path to the area boss in a way that was very difficult to run past or circumvent. Also, it adopted some creative solutions for players to select difficulty, like the Covenant of Champions and the use of bonfire ascetics. It was regarded as a mixed bag, however, and veterans tended to dislike the game more than expected, while newcomers were on average warmer to the style. In Dark Souls 3, these changes were reversed, and a more fast-paced style of combat was adopted, leading to an increased importance on learning bosses' movements and roll timings. Combat became less about tactics and more about finding punishing windows and reflexes. At the same time, it was never easier to summon players or NPCs to help with the fights, or to gather materials for upgrading weapons, or to change builds, or even to know where to go, as the game was very linear. Some great things associated with the original Dark Souls and its sequel were then abandoned in favor of more player convenience. More combat-based difficulty around reflexes and learning delays for attacks. It was a success, but a limited one. Grounded combat was sacrificed to some extent, and bosses became more similar tests, compared to the variety of Demon Souls and Dark Souls. These combat changes were imported from Bloodborne, which had an even faster rhythm to it, almost frantic in some situations. However, these features were much better suited for the gothic horror game than for the Souls series if you ask me, as the presence of the rally mechanic, the quick step dodge, and the transformational attacks all incentivized the more aggressive style. Sekiro is even faster but a much different combat system, removing stamina from the core and replacing it with posture, based around deflecting attacks from the enemy as both a defensive and offensive option. By having different systems, Bloodborne and Sekiro were differentiated enough from Souls to still be somewhat challenging for veterans, solving the difficulty equation by changing its parameters. Being a new intellectual property, Elden Ring had the right to be its own thing. And it is. But it is also a mess. A beautiful, moderately dark, definitely twisted high fantasy concept, but also an ultimately unbalanced, mind-scratching mess. In some spots, the game has some of the best boss fights from software ever crafted. But sometimes it is very hard to see the point of some decisions they made. And it all boils down to how Elden Ring solved the difficulty equation and how the solution spells the end of Souls. Dark Souls is dark fantasy, in the sense that otherworldly and fantastic beings and situations are presented under a somber tone and at a human level of observation. You do not play as the literal god of war or the son of a demon. You are the chosen undead or Ashen One or whatever, but a very meek one in comparison to the higher beings you are supposed to slay. The games never let you become too powerful in order to accomplish the task at hand. It instead goes for a decadent theme overall, emphasizing how much the game world has fallen from grace. Gwyn, once the mightiest of gods, is now a pathetic old man trying to grab you, a shell of himself. At the same time, you might have gained 100 levels during the game, but you still are very killable around this dying world. In Elden Ring, some of the dark fantasy aspects were unquestionably abandoned. It still portrays a decadent world, worsened off by cataclysmic events and a long, all-out war between demigods. These were incredibly powerful beings, but now they are tired and spent and vulnerable. But not at a Dark Souls or even Bloodborne point just yet. Wonder and amazement are still present in large quantities, both on the enemy side and on the player side. Sorceries were never so flashy and varied and outright fantastic looking. Legendary and rare weapons have incredible abilities that can basically be considered spells, but ordinary weapons also have them, and can be infused with these abilities at will. It is a dark fantasy presented in a garb of awesomeness. Getting closer to high fantasy is likely what From Software wanted from the beginning. The collaboration of George R.R. Martin in the creation of the Lands Between backstory is great evidence. His most famous work is clearly dark fantasy, but the author of A Song of Ice and Fire is also the author of many other works that tended to be weird and fantastic. His collaboration seems like a good way to bridge the gap between dark and high fantasy without losing what makes each style interesting. This can be seen through lore and presentation, but how does that get realized in terms of gameplay? First, major bosses and also some minor ones were developed with spectacle in mind. Gone are the days when the final boss was a pathetic blob or an old spent man who does not even say anything before attacking you. From Software made sure even the disrespected Godric would have his moment to shine. Undeniably, there are many cool moments in these fights, from the eye-opening fire giant phase transition to the meteor one-shot in Radahn's encounter. This tendency in itself represents not exactly a shift in tone, as it is consistent with the more recent boss fights they developed. But there are a lot more of these moments now, and they had to be translated into more complex movesets, more aggressiveness, and high numbers to really get the point across. Hence the impression many players had that bosses were too overtuned, even among veterans of the series. There are many theories on the internet to explain that. Some consider the boss design in Sekiro creeped in too much in Elden Ring, something supported by millennia, but not much by other bosses in my opinion. Others think they were designed with summons in mind. I had that impression as well, but now I do not think it is accurate. In fact, if anything, the game suffers from not being designed around summons, as the AI is still too primitive to deal with multiple sources of damage. My own theory is that the difficulty equation is the main culprit here. There are only so many options From Software had to increase the challenge given the combat system restraints, and they decided to adopt most or all of them for the most important encounters, reducing their own margin of error to make really fair and engaging fights. It is harder than ever to avoid some moves and combos without playing too passively or engaging in trading hits with the bosses. When analyzing closely, it is noticeable that even main bosses do not have a greatly varied moveset, but it feels like that sometimes because now bosses can switch moves in their combos based on player actions, and attacks that are somewhat simple can behave erratically due to tracking, input reading, and other AI tricks. The difficulty added by delayed attacks in Dark Souls 3 was a predictable development once Souls players figure out rows were the optimal solution for combat. To increase the difficulty further, even more delayed attacks were introduced in Elden Ring, but also an overload of area of effect moves, to prevent players from merely dodging around the bosses. If their weapon did not catch you, this explosion or this magical effect on the floor will do. People in the Souls community often confuse the terms and consider everything that is possible to dodge as being fair. However, something being possible is not the same as being reasonable, or even intended by the developer. Another evidence is the numbers. Elden Ring is a big game, but it still uses mostly the Dark Souls 3 system and scales for leveling. I was expecting it to be more compressed actually, so you would remain at relatively lower levels for an extended period of time, so I ended up exploring the Weeping Peninsula without leveling up and without torrent in my first playthrough. But it turns out that was not the case. From Software was likely expecting players to gain many levels before really engaging with the main quest, and it tuned the enemies and bosses accordingly. For example, Margit does not deal that much damage actually. You may think so because you can get hit multiple times during his combos, but his HP demonstrates how they were approaching their numbers. Margit has 4,174 points of health, comparable to Dragon Slayer Armor, a late game boss in Dark Souls 3. And this is the first main boss in the game. It got to such extremes that Maliketh, one of the last bosses you will fight to beat the game, is widely considered in the community a glass cannon, despite having 5 digits of HP. While he can deal so much damage, you always think you did not level Vigor enough. But you can do a lot more damage as well, you might be thinking. Yes, that is true. So far I only talked about one side of the difficulty equation. Remember, It was about providing a challenge to veterans, while at the same time not alienating too many new players. This is where we talk about ashes. Interestingly enough, there are two types of items with the Ash name: Ashes of War and Spirit Ashes. More interestingly even is that they are very similar in what they can do to the game. The potential to break it by reducing the challenge so significantly that it can feel like the game has two modes: ultra hard and easy, or maybe normal, or maybe just hard, it depends. However, only the Spirit Ashes got criticism from some try-hard fans because it makes the game too easy. I will not repeat the argument saying there is not only one right way to play the game, or you can enjoy the game however you like, because they actually sound very condescending to me. We have to go back to Hidetaka Miyazaki and his statement saying that difficulty in itself was not the point, but actually providing a sense of accomplishment. Obtaining that sense will be a subjective experience, and I can speak to my own playthroughs. I felt accomplished defeating Malenia using only sorceries, but I did not feel the same ganking her with the Mimic tier. And I could explain why, but it would only make sense for my experience. What I really want to emphasize about this topic are two things. First, people who shun players who used Spirit Ash summons while then themselves used Ashes of War, they are hypocrites. Scott Yound has an interesting video about how over half the Ashes of War in the game can one-shot other players in PvP if you do the right optimizations. But even if you do not min-max for damage, they are very powerful in PvE. If the point of discouraging players from using spirit summons is to keep the challenge, you should also avoid using some Ashes of War, maybe a majority of them. If you did not use them as much or did not experiment with them enough to know how utterly unbalanced they can be, this is me with a level 1 character using Flame of the Red Mains on Lich Dragon Fortisex. He is obliterated by it. Despite having very high poise and despite being a dragon that breathes fire. How an attack that consists of throwing a magic flame arc is expected to do this to a fire-breathing legendary creature is beyond me. It speaks to the abandonment of groundedness and the poor balancing in Elden Ring, where apparently everything is a cannon, and the only way they found to balance it was to make them out of glass as well. This is not to say that you should not use Ashes of War or Spirit Ashes, actually quite the opposite. My second point is that although you are not exactly playing it wrong if you do not use these options, you are probably not getting the most out of the experience. Part of the appeal of Elden Ring is a bit distinct from what Dark Souls offered. You absolutely can master the fights and defeat a boss without using these tools in a very grounded manner, but the game design screams for you to don the garb of awesomeness. From Software clearly tried to make the flashy tools interesting, fun to use, and powerful like the skills of Dark Souls 3 never actually were. There are 64 Spirit Ashes in the game, 92 Ashes of War without counting the ones exclusive to some special weapons, and although there is little complexity in how they operate, just hit L2 and learn how long the animation takes. You can develop different strategies for particular encounters by using them. The problem is, these strategies tend to feel like cheesing the game a lot of the time. And I think it all boils down to implementation. Ashes of War work as a way to allow variety for the players without forcing them to upgrade every single weapon they have just to use their special abilities. But at the same time, it is so easy to swap them between encounters that the decision making over the course of the game is practically absent. Only some short-term planning after facing a challenge that might require a change in style. Some players will appreciate not having to commit too much to their choices, but weightless decisions are not very meaningful in a playthrough. I was lucky to not fully explore the system in my first run, and I kept one of the silliest and surprisingly fun abilities for most of the playthrough, the Ground Slam. Turns out it is also very powerful in dealing pure damage and provoking stance breaks. With Spirit Ashes, the problem is how implementation was not creative. When I first heard Ronnie saying,
"The spirits will obey thine command but briefly,"
I thought it would work similarly to the Tibia summons spell, or mechanics in other games that allow a power-up mode for a few seconds. Instead, you just get a reskin of a regular enemy to fight on your side until they die or the boss dies. Some spirits are fun to throw around in battle, but it's still very uninspired as a mechanic. Another problem is how there is absolutely no downside to it, making it almost always the optimal choice, with the possible exception of some summons against Malenia. Finally, it significantly decreases the incentive for multiplayer co-op, as asking for help from strangers, one of the best features in all Souls, still increases boss health and resistances, making fights more difficult than when you're using your Pokémons. This is where End of Souls rings truer than ever. The core of the grounded combat is still there, and some additions are good ideas like guard counters and jump attacks, but the superiority of the special moves funnels players into a high fantasy approach that values spectacle over grit. I can enjoy the spectacle, and I can have fun making more damage from a weird scream than from a sword attack, and I have to say, it is addictive to try new things every time. But it got as far as it can from the Souls formula without deviating so much that it becomes another thing entirely, even more than Sekiro. The limit has been reached, and now the simplicity of the combat system counts against it, becoming more reliant than ever on using fantastical moves and not in providing a more human-scale struggle against godly forces. Elden Ring is trying to meet two objectives halfway, and when one flourishes, the other suffers. Elden Ring represented a culmination in both senses. It is the ultimate RPG fantasy world experience From Software ever put in front of players, but it also pushed its core mechanics so much to solve the difficulty equation that balancing the challenges became an issue. It is one of the best exploration endeavors you can find in video games, with just enough convenience that it is not painful to experience. However, there are very few interesting mechanics for exploration compared to other games, as it stands out mostly by not having bad things rather than having new good things. A lot of freedom in how to experience the game that can backfire in a number of ways due to a less carefully balanced interaction of systems than ideal. There are some spectacular combat encounters, but some are heavily diminished through gameplay by being unreasonably hard or laughably easy. Also, too much repetition that feels like awkwardly padding the length and size of the game. Where do we go from here? A sequel or a new IP with Souls gameplay will not resist the urge to be even bigger and flashier, and will likely descend further into confusing bullshit for a challenge. Elden Ring rests right now at a delicate identity conflict, in which part of it wants to deliver the best Dark Souls possible, but struggles to live inside its original constraints. There is still enough Souls in it to be liked by veterans, and there is also enough awesomeness to capture a lot of new players that are attracted by other features. But moving it further will require drastic changes. If bosses can change attacks and directions mid-combo, players need more options to counter that, including but not limited to the ability to cancel their own attacks and animations. If special abilities are going to be the focus, then they need to do more than just deal a set amount of damage. Stance breaks are a good start, but a lot more is needed. If spirit summons are going to be present forever, please make the AI more intelligent to deal with them and the player. Notice that all of these points would make the combat system more complex, also allowing bosses and enemies to be more complex without being unreasonable or unfair. But the cost would be to change the fundamentals of the original system so much that it is not Souls anymore. Action commitment would have to be much more flexible. Mana would likely have to be more thought out and important, with stamina being therefore less important, and so on. A step back to the classic style seems unlikely due to the huge success of Elden Ring. Maybe a sequel to Bloodborne or Sekiro could take better advantage of what was developed, but only because they already work differently somewhat, making it easier to repurpose their foundations. Another option is to not revisit the series so soon. Market pressure will definitely play a role in it, but I welcome the rumors that their next project is to resuscitate the Armored Core franchise. If this is indeed going to be the end of Souls, it might be for the best that ushering in its successor takes more time and thought in development than just pretending it will be a seamless transition. Meanwhile, we can wait for a DLC extension to be even more of the fun, incredibly addictive, but utterly unbalanced mess that Elden Ring already is.